It is my goal in life to learn as many different fiber art techniques as I possibly can, and one method that I would like to add to my collection is weaving. But unlike sewing or knitting, weaving requires a bit more equipment than just a needle and thread or 2 sticks and some yarn. At least for the kind of weaving that I want to do, I'd like to be able to make larger pieces of textiles that I can make into other things. Based on my research, a lot of people recommend frame looms for beginners. They're relatively cheap and simple to use, but those are typically used to make smaller textiles since you're limited to the size of the frame. I guess I could make a really big frame loom, but then I would have to store a really big frame loom, and I'd rather not. For bigger textiles, I generally saw people recommend a rigid heddle tabletop loom as a beginner-friendly, less expensive option. The good people on Reddit say that if you're lucky, you can find one secondhand for only $100 or $200, which is definitely less expensive than the giant floor looms and other options, but it's still a good chunk of money just to find out if I even enjoy this technique. I also tried looking into classes or weaving guilds in my area to see if I could just try it out without having to make that big investment, but I didn't really have any luck. Most of the events that I found were meetups for more experienced weavers or events for kids where they teach them how to make pot holders. No disrespect to pot holders, but that's not really what I'm looking for. But people have been weaving for thousands of years and developing unique styles across hundreds of different cultures, so there has to be some method of weaving that involves less expensive equipment. So I did some more research and I came across the technique of backstrap weaving, where the weaver themselves is a part of the loom. They use their body as an anchor point for their work. And the equipment for this technique really boils down to a couple of sticks and some string. That's an oversimplification, of course, but from my research it seems like everything that I would need to get started I might already have on hand. So is it possible for me to learn how to weave as a complete beginner without spending any money? That is what I would like to find out in this video. So a few things before we get started. First of all, what exactly is backstrap weaving? As I said before, it is a weaving technique that uses the weaver's body as a part of the loom. You have a strap that goes around your back, hence the name backstrap weaving, and that strap is connected to a series of sticks and strings. They're all strung together in a specific way to form a loom so that you can weave fabric. One end of the work is attached to a fixed point and the other is anchored to your body, so you can lean forward and backwards to add or release tension onto your work as you weave. This is a traditional weaving technique that is used in many different cultures across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, but from my research it seems like it's most commonly associated with Andean culture, so Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. That specific region and those cultures' specific styles of backstrap weaving are what I saw referenced most commonly, but there are variations using a similar method found throughout the world. Another thing to note, as I said, I'm a total beginner. I don't know what I'm doing, so if I use the incorrect terminology or explain things poorly, my apologies. I'm doing my best, but there's a lot of new words. There's sheds. Why are there sheds? I don't want to go in the shed. Last time I was in a shed, I dropped a chia pet fur coat, and it was a bad time. And I'm not providing context to that statement. My main resource for this is going to be a blog by a woman named Laverne Waddington. Whenever I would look up backstrap weaving and look at any source, someone would mention Laverne Waddington. She comes up all the time. Her blog is like the main resource for people trying to learn backstrap weaving from what I can tell. I will link her blog down below. Fair warning, she started the website in I think 2009. And you can definitely tell that's not meant to be like a dig or anything. It's just very much an older website and has a lot of older website quirks and can be a little bit difficult to navigate. I've been reading a lot of like forum discussions about getting started in weaving, and there seem to be some mixed opinions about backstrap weaving as a beginner technique. Some people are like, yeah, it's great, it's super easy, you can pick it up really quickly, it's really cheap to get started. And then other people who are like, do not even attempt to try this without a one-on-one in-person instructor. I feel like it's always worth trying and seeing for yourself, but maybe this is going to be more difficult than I might have been led to believe. There's one person on Reddit or something who was just like, many people have been taken in by Laverne's blog, and I'm like, what did she do to you? I also wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer on the whole learning to weave without spending any money. Obviously, I'm a crafty person. I have stuff that the average Joe Schmo might not have in their homes. I knit, I sew, I crochet, so I have yarn on hand. I have various sticks and tubes. I might be using stuff that I have on hand, but you might not have on hand. But I believe everything I need for this is going to be relatively affordable if you did have to buy it new. I don't want this to be one of those videos where someone's like, I recreated this expensive piece of furniture for half the cost. All you need is $10,000 worth of equipment and 20 years worth of experience. This should be a relatively affordable project for the average person, and for the average crafty person, I would assume you would have at least some of this stuff already on hand. So with all of that said, we can get started with the first step, which is warping. Okay, so the first step in all of this, first step is to move my tea out of the way. So the first step is setting up the warp, and that is the yarn that's going straight away from your body. The mnemonic that I've heard is that the warp goes warp speed ahead, and the weft goes weft to right. You need 2 vertical posts, and you're wrapping the yarn around them in figure 8s. Whoa! So on Laverne's website, she recommends clamps. It needs to be something that like is rigidly attached to your table, and the sort of clamp, you can just use the handles themselves as your warping posts. So they need to be a yard apart. That's the best angle you're gonna get in this setup. I'm gonna go ahead and pre-prep my knitting needles is what I'm using to secure this. She's got them wrapped together with rubber bands. Got those ready, and then more rubber bands for later. I do need something to secure down the end of that. No, it's not really secure. Oh, and I just ripped the yarn. Okay, off to a great start. This is the yarn I'm using for my warp. It's just a worsted weight cotton. It's not Lily Sugar and Cream brand, but it's that yarn. If you know, you know. So how exactly does she do this? So you're wrapping between the 2 posts, going in a figure 8. So you go down, around, back down, and around. And you're doing that over and over. My tension is really bad here. Yeah, no, I've definitely fucked that up. I need to redo this. Okay. To preserve the cross from the figure 8 wrapping pattern, I slipped the knitting needles that I rubber banded together earlier into the 2 loops of the warp. I also threaded some scrap yarn through the loops at the ends and tied them off to keep everything together. Then I slipped the warp off the posts. With the warp prepared, I moved on to cutting a shuttle out of sturdy cardboard to wind the weft yarn onto. So I've got the warp prepared. I've got a shuttle wound for the weft. So this is the rest of my materials. Got 2 pieces of dowel. These are just random chunks that I have on hand. One of them does look like it's been chewed on by a human being, and I don't know why, but it's what I have. So these are gonna be my loom bars. I've got a ruler to use as the beater sword. Got a pillowcase to use as the backstrap. That's what I'm weaving, by the way. The first project that she suggests that you do is making your own backstrap. So until I have that made, I'm using a pillowcase. I also need to grab some cardboard. That's the good stuff. And then I've got some rope. This is just paracord that I have. I'm going to tie the ends onto my loom bars here. That's that. Yeah, that feels good. For my anchor point, I've got, this is actually like a desk mount attachment for like a camera. Like you would attach a camera to this. I've got the other pieces taken off, but this is what I'm using so I can have it like desk height and work in my chair, because I think that's going to be the most comfortable. Then I need to tie rope to the ends of my pillowcase and then tie those onto my other loom bar. So I've got the first loom bar, and I'm gonna put my warp onto it. Here's where I need to back up. Probably not a good idea to start with such a long warp. I don't even know how much of this is in frame. That's gonna slip and slide around though. Let me add some rubber bands to this. Okay, so I've got the warp set up, so it's time to set up the continuous string heddles. The heddles are what opens up the shed, which is the gap between the alternating warp fibers. So we have like this opening here now, but we need to be able to switch that so we can alternate what we're weaving, because we're going over, under, and then we need to go under, over in the next row. I don't know if any of that's making sense. So I've got some more yarn. Pass your heddle string under the warps that are passing over the lower cross stick. Anchor the string with your left thumb while pulling up more string from between the first and second warps. Draw the string up and over your left hand. The first string is now enclosed in its heddle. Continue like this across the warp. Last guy. There we go. So another tie-up piece of yarn through all the loops that were wound over your hand, and tie an overhand knot. So I'm taking another piece of yarn, I'm going under all of these warp yarns and pulling that through, and then we tie the ends together to make a loop. There we go. So now this lifts up all these strings, and this lifts up all of these strings. So now I remove the sticks. Now I am ready to start weaving.
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
How did she do that?
Against which to start weaving.
Got my sturdy piece of cardboard. Wait, what? I'm very confused. What is she doing? Oh, hers just slide around real easy. So she like pulls up on this loop. Perhaps, okay. How do I get past the heddles? Oh, do I lean? Is this where the leaning happens? This is when the change happens. I'm not quite sure. Let me try and space it out a bit better. She just opens it and then slides her hand like, so I pull up with that one, kind of separate them. There we go. Okay. And then I gotta get my hand in here. Maybe the ruler just stays right there for the rest of my life. Well, I can just cut this down, actually. I've had a piece of cardboard. My other loom bar has slipped. It did that. Yeah. Oh, there goes my ruler. Okay. I mean, that can't be good. Push that down with the ruler, and then insert this. Damn it, I dropped my ruler again. Don't worry about that later. Okay, now what, Laverne? So I'm gonna pull up on the heddles, and that should separate everything. It should. Is this what sticky warp means? God damn, my back hurts already. Where are you and what are you doing? I'm having a bad time, guys. I fear my shuttle is far too big. Oh! Ah! Oh, please. For the love of God. Oh, good. My ruler. It's supposed to pop open. It's not popping open, Laverne. Why is that so loose? Oh, okay. I need a break. So I made several mistakes here, if you couldn't tell. First off, the tension on my warp threads was uneven, so that caused everything to want to lean to one side. Secondly, I had misread the instructions on Laverne's blog, but in my defense, they were kind of confusingly written. She wants you to weave a narrow band as practice first, then weave a wider piece to make a backstrap for your first full project. But she explains how to set up the warp for the backstrap first, then explains how to weave the narrow band without mentioning that you need to set up a new warp, then jumps back to the backstrap. I thought that was all instructions for the backstrap, which is a critical error because there is a different process for setting up the loom for a wider warp. You put the heddle strings onto a stick so that it's easier to control them and lift them all at the same time. You also don't have a shed loop, that little ring of white yarn at the far end of my first attempt. You use a shed stick, again making it easier to control as a unit. All of that information is contained in a video, which is embedded into the text of the blog post, so you can't notice at a glance that you're supposed to do something different. After that realization, I sat down and read through everything in the blog post, watched all the videos, and a lot of things were cleared up. I also realized that there was too much friction between my warp yarn and the heddles. Laverne recommends mercerized cotton, both for weaving and for the heddles. Mercerization is a chemical treatment that can be done to yarn or fabric made from plant fibers that makes it stronger and gives it a smoother finish. I was using unmercerized cotton for the heddles and warp, which created far too much friction, leading to the warp threads sticking together and getting bound to the heddles with little blobs of yarn fuzz, making it impossible to open the shed and be able to weave. After some time away from this project, I was able to come back and apply all of my revelations on a second attempt. Good morning, it is the next day. So I took apart that first weaving I had set up, and I went ahead and did a smaller one that was just 12 revolutions, so I guess that's 24 ends, and made it much shorter. I think I only did like 18 inches instead of a yard. So that was much easier to control and manipulate, and ended up with a nice little woven band here. The edges are definitely a little wonky. My tension at the beginning was definitely not the best. There's some weirdness there, but I think I got it going pretty good further along. I wasn't really sure how to finish this, because in the post she gives instructions on how to finish the backstrap. She has you take all the warp ends off and braid them together, and then attach them in a way to make a loop so that you can tie it to the rope and tie it to your loom, which makes sense for the backstrap, but this is not, you know, a backstrap, it's just a little band. So I just cut the warp ends off the loom bars and then tied them together with like little square knots. So I've got some long fringe. I'll probably trim the fringe down more just because it's so long. And I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I don't know if I'm going to do anything. It could be a nice bookmark. Could be maybe a necklace. So now I'm going to set up that wider warp project to make the backstrap. So I'm going to wrap that warp again, get that all set up, and then figure out how to do this different heddle and shed. Figure out this different shed and heddle setup and try and get that working. I decided to be all fancy this time with the wider warp and do some stripes. Backstrap weaving gives you a warp-faced fabric, meaning that you mainly see the warp yarns in the finished product, while the weft is mostly covered. That means you can make bands of different colors when you wrap your warp, and that will give you stripes along the length of the fabric. I sat on the floor this time to set up the loom, since it was so much longer. I didn't have enough space to move my chair far back enough. Sitting on the floor also meant I was able to keep my tools within arm's reach much easier since I couldn't drop them. Oh, there goes my ruler. Damn it, I dropped my ruler again. Oh, good. My ruler. But unfortunately, my back started to hurt after a while, so eventually I had to move back to the chair. I also set up my heddles correctly this time, using a knitting needle for more support. I started out still using the same unmercerized cotton yarn, since it had worked out okay for the narrow band, but not so much with the wider warp, and especially not with the green yarns that I was using for the backstrap. There was a lot of friction, and I was getting big clumps of fuzz that tangled everything up. Eventually, I removed the cotton yarn heddles and switched to a polyester satin-faced ribbon. This was much smoother, almost no friction, no clumps of fuzz, and led to a much easier time weaving. I used another knitting needle as the shed stick, and I used a shorter loom bar for the far end of the warp. I found that with the longer dowel, there was a lot more tipping and swaying as I worked, but the shorter stick was much more stable. The shorter bar is actually just the tube from a roll of aluminum foil, and that was sturdy enough to withstand the tension. Another change I made was winding much less weft yarn onto my shuttle. Originally, I had been worried about running out of the weft, so I put a ton of yarn on the shuttle, but this made it too bulky to easily fit through the shed, the opening between the two layers of the warp yarn. Less weft makes it easier to throw the shuttle, plus I went through weft a lot slower than I expected to. Weaving doesn't seem to eat up as much yarn as knitting or crochet does, which was my frame of reference, and it's also really simple to add in a new weft. Okay, so I've gotten the rhythm sort of down. It's definitely still not perfect, but things are working a lot better ever since I replaced the heddle string, so I figured I would give like a better clear shot of what I'm actually doing. There's just so much stuff on the floor. There's a fork. I was doing something with a fork at some point. I don't remember what, but there's a fork. I don't need it. You don't need a fork. I just did a pass under the heddle warps, so now I need to open the other shed. Apologies if I'm getting the terminology wrong. I don't know what I'm doing, but here's what I am doing. Lifting up on the shed stick and then putting my sword in. My sword is a ruler. And then to open that, you lean back a little bit and you rotate the sword. And then that makes the other layer of the warp threads pop up. Mine are a little wonky because I messed up with the warp when I was wrapping the warp. The clamps I had on the table, one of them shifted slightly and I didn't realize. So the first chunk of my warp is a little bit longer, so everything's slightly at an angle. So I have to kind of like twist in a weird way to get this to work, but it's fine. It's practice. I'm learning. I know not to do that again. Get your hand under there, pull out the ruler, put it back in. And beat down your weft, rotate the sword onto its side to make a space here. I take the shuttle and I pass it through. And I get that settled down, beat it with the sword, pop that back open, and then I hold the loop, pinch it, and pull it tight, making sure not to like over snug it and make things warpy. Then you beat it down, remove the sword, and then we open the heddle shed. So just kind of slide them around a little bit, lean forward a little bit to release some of the tension, and put the sword in, and then beat that down, and then you pass the shuttle again. Get that snugged. And then tighten it down ever so gently. And then you just repeat that over and over again until you're done. And I have realized that with the green stripes on the warp and the red for the weft, I am kind of making a watermelon, which was not intentional, but I'm also not mad about it. The setup is definitely the hardest part in all of this. Once you get going, it's not that difficult. You gotta maintain your tension and everything. And it is that kind of thing where if you make a mistake at the beginning, you're going to be dealing with it for the rest of the project. Hence the weird sloping, slanting stuff I've got going on. If you do a good job at the start, you don't have to worry about that. So just don't do a bad job. Once I had woven to the last 6 or so inches of my warp, it was time to finish off the backstrap. I crochet chain stitched some doubled up cotton yarn to make some cords, then braided the ends of my warp threads together and slipped the loop ends of the braids onto the cords. The ends of the cords could then be tied together to make a ring that can be slipped onto the loom bar. Okay, so the backstrap is all done, and I think it came out pretty good. There's definitely some flaws in it. I had some issues with the heddles. I don't know if I like didn't catch all of the warp threads that I was supposed to in the heddle string, or if some of the loops on the heddle strings were like a little too long so the warp threads didn't pull up as high as I needed to. I'm not sure what exactly the issue is. I have a few little floats of the warp threads on one side of it. They're not super bad. This is the biggest one, it's like an inch. The rest of them are like 1 or 2 rows long. I might go in by hand and stitch those down if they become an issue. There are also a couple patches where you can see the weft through because I didn't pull up. Oh, I guess they're sitting here like I'm not sure what exactly happened to be able to see the warp on this side. Maybe something similar to what happened with the floats. No, it's literally this exact same thing. That's just the other side from where the float is. So it's because that little bit of warp thread should be on this side of the weaving. And because it isn't, you can see the weft through. I know to be more careful to avoid that. I'm learning. I think overall it came out pretty nice. Like this half of it, this part of it looks great. So I guess now I should put this to use and start weaving something else. And I think this time I'm gonna try and make a little bag, just like a little cell phone sized purse, a little bit wider than what I wove for the backstrap and a little bit shorter. So then I can just like have a little pouch and a little flap to fold over and then stitch up the sides. Or I guess I could weave a strap and kind of make that as the sides and just have it kind of arc around. I think that'll be cute. Maybe for the strap I can try a pattern. I haven't really looked into that. I know on the blog she has a second method of winding the warp threads in a way that gives you two colors to make horizontal stripes, so that could be fun. So maybe if I'm feeling brave, I will attempt that, but first I need to make the body of the purse. For the bag, I wanted to use some yarn that I had salvaged a few years ago by unraveling some of my old sweaters. I wanted to make sure my warp tension was even this time, so I used one of those jar opener grip pads to add more grip between the clamp and the table, but then I realized the real solution was just to make sure the clamps were turned as far as the warp could pull them before I started warping, so they didn't get the chance to move. Then I wrapped my warp. I determined that the back strap, including the braided ends, was about 20% shorter than the warp I had started with, so I figured out how big I wanted the bag to be, added 20%, then added a little bit more just to be safe. I did stripes again for this warp, and I held the green and brown yarns double for some stripes to hopefully get a sort of speckled look. For this piece, I wanted the ends to have a clean edge with no fringe, so I did as Laverne suggests and put the starting end of the warp onto a thin metal knitting needle, which I then secured to the loom bar with zip ties. When the weaving is done, the needle can be pulled out, leaving very small loops that will make a clean finished edge. Laverne has no advice for a clean edge at the far end of the warp, so I was going to have to figure that out on my own. I also switched out the material for the heddle string for a third time. The satin ribbon had worked really well in terms of reducing friction, but since it was a bit wider compared to the yarn, it added a bit of bulk and sort of splayed out the warps a bit. To fix this, I switched to a synthetic mason's twine, which I had on hand from a previous project. I used it to make a fishing net in my Percy Jackson dress video, and it was so slippery I could barely keep it tied in knots, so I figured it would work great for the heddles. And it did. Very low friction without adding any bulk. When I had a long enough piece of the woven fabric, I could slip the thin knitting needle out from the starting edge and used a tapestry needle to thread the starting tail of the weft through the little loops to get a nice clean selvage. The other end of the work was another story. I removed all my sundry sticks and tubes and strings, and I was left with a fringy mess of warp ends to deal with. I did some research to try and find a method of finishing this piece, and landed on the half Damascus technique, where you tie the ends off and then weave the tails into the work. I didn't love this method, partly because there were so many ends to weave in, and partly because I think this technique is meant more for weft face weaving, where you have vertical channels you can easily bury your ends into. My warp-faced fabric, on the other hand, has horizontal channels that make it difficult to hide my ends. I've since found another method I'd like to try, where you loop your warp not around a loom bar, but through loops of fishing line, which in turn are wrapped around the loom bar. The tutorial I found for this method is meant for tapestry weaving in a frame loom, but I think it could be adapted for a backstrap loom. If there are any more experienced weavers watching and they have any suggestions for finishing techniques or anything else really, please do share in the comments. I'd love to get feedback and find out new ways to improve. I'll also be linking the tutorials for both the Damascus finish and the fishing line method in the description if you're interested. So I'm not quite done weaving in all the ends on the main purse piece. But I'm getting very bored of it and I want to do something else, so I will finish that later. And now I'm going to start weaving the strap. I want to try and do something a little bit fancier on the strap. There is a method of doing horizontal stripes going across. What you do is you have two colors for the warp as you're wrapping, and you have two additional posts set up, and so you're kind of doing like extra figure eight wrapping in a way so that you have your two layers of warp threads as you're weaving. One layer is going to be one color and the other layer is the other. So as you're doing like over, under the weaving, your over threads are going to be one color and the unders are going to be another. I don't know if that made any sense. I will link the tutorial for this down below in the description if you want to try or at least understand what I mean. But I'm figuring out how to do that with my setup here, because I'm going to need to warp quite a long piece to make a long strap, so I need to go across the angle of my desk. I'm going to try and put extra clamps on the armrests of my desk chair. I don't know how bad of an idea this is, because the chair obviously swivels. I don't need them to be super sturdy because the yarn's not wrapping around it the same way it is with the end posts that I have. It's just kind of like splitting the yarn around it to kind of divert it in the correct direction, so I think this will be okay. I hope it'll be okay. And it did go okay. I used a yardstick with a dowel extender tied onto it to mark the straight line between the two end warping posts so I could position the chair just so that the middle clamps would be aligned. The chair was a bit wobbly, but not so much that it caused any problems. The stripy warp technique is a bit more complicated and fiddly than the basic method, but it's really just a matter of crisscrossing your two colors of yarn in the right pattern. I only needed a narrow warp this time since I'm weaving a thin band, so this process didn't take long at all. Then I could set up my loom and weave just as I had for all the pieces before. The only difference was that the warp yarns looked really cool when I opened the shed and the second color pops out. Once I had finished weaving, I tied off and wove in the warp ends on the strap. I also finished weaving in the ends of the bag piece. I left the ends long on the center stripe of the bag and tied them into a tassel as a little detail for the flap of the bag. This was definitely an aesthetic choice and not because I was sick of weaving in ends. Then I could assemble the bag by stitching the main piece and the strap together using a bit more of the green yarn and a tapestry needle. The main piece just wraps around in a loop with a bit of overlap for the flap, and the strap makes up the sides. And with that, my first full weaving project was complete. So let's return to the central question of this video. Can I learn how to weave without spending any money? Yes, I think pretty obviously. But you might be thinking, can you learn how to weave without spending any money? I don't know. I don't know what stuff you own. For all I know, you inherited your great aunt Ethel's fully functioning treadle loom, so in that case, yes, you can start weaving without spending any money. Obviously. Why did you ask? But seriously, it all depends on what you already have on hand. I think it's pretty safe to assume that most people who are seriously interested in learning how to weave are probably already into some other fiber art based hobbies like knitting or crochet, so you probably already have yarn and knitting needles and rulers and scissors that you can use. But if not, those things are pretty easy to get at a very low price. I think the main sticking point for most people is going to be the clamps that you need to set up the warp. That feels like the one thing that most people might not already have on hand. The ones that I used, I borrowed from my dad. He doesn't know that I borrowed them, but I did give them back, so it still counts as borrowing. The ones that I was using are pretty nice quality and can be a bit expensive, but I was able to find some online for like $10 a piece, but I also can't vouch for the quality on those, and you do really want something fairly sturdy that's not going to bend. Ironically enough, to set up your warp, you need something that's not going to warp. And of course I'm using the clamps in place of actual warping posts or a warping board, but from my research those seem to be either much more expensive than clamps or they're pretty cheap, but you also need to clamp them down with your own clamps. So I don't really have an alternative suggestion on that front, but I'm sure there are other solutions. You just gotta be creative and find something that works with what you have. I think backstrap weaving is not the easiest thing to learn on your own. It's definitely very fiddly and there's a lot of setup you gotta get right. You kind of have to develop a sense of how things are supposed to feel as you're working, and that just takes a lot of practice. But it's also not totally impossible to figure out on your own like some people online seem to think, so I would definitely recommend giving it a shot if you're interested. I will link all of the resources I talked about down below if you want to check them out, and I hope this video showed you some mistakes to avoid, or at the very least was entertaining to watch. Thank you all so much for watching, and an extra thank you to all of my patrons who support me over on Patreon, especially those in the Magnanimous Maelstroms tier: Oscar, Obi Nick Kenobi, Evelyn, Trapped in the Midwest, Bear Hardy, and Perfect Primrose. My Patreon will also be linked down below if you are interested in checking that out. Obligatory reminder to click some buttons down below to make the YouTube robots happy if you feel so inclined, and another reminder to have a good rest of your day. I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye. Am I out of frame? Am I out of frame yet? Oh god! I better be.